This is week 2 for experimental psychology. Today we're going to cover communication in psychology and the basic parts of a research project, a little bit of APA stuff, a science fair for psychology graduates and undergraduates. Ultimately, we want to publish our research in a peer-reviewed journal. Now, peer-reviewed means that when you submit your paper to the journal, the editor of that journal will take that paper and it will send it out without your name on it, blindly send it out to other professionals. Typically, these are people who have also published research in that journal. And those other professionals will evaluate that manuscript, that research report, based on the quality, based on the methodological soundness. Like, did you do a good study? Did you adequately address the flaws in the study? Do your results make sense? Did you do a good job with your statistical analyses? And are you making a scientific contribution? Have we learned something from the study that you did that makes it worthy enough to publish in a journal? And there are 3 things that can typically happen at this point. So as serving as a reviewer, I might get a paper in and I'll sit and I'll read through it. And then I will make some notes on pros and cons, things they did good, things they did poorly, and then I'll make a decision. I'll make a recommendation to the editor. I'll say, you can either accept this paper as it's written, which almost never happens. The second thing that can happen would be a revise and resubmit, which means you did a good job in this paper, but I do have some questions and things that I'd like you to address before I think it would be good to publish. And then the last layer is a rejection. And with the rejection, you're saying, hopefully you're saying kindly, this is good research, but it's just not a good fit for this journal, or there are some problems with this research as it currently stands that I don't think you could overcome, but here's some suggestions for how you can make this paper better. Ideally, sometimes reviewers are mean. I mean, I'm never mean, but sometimes they're mean. And you have to have thick skin about getting rejections like that. But ideally, they're constructive. Now, when we write these papers, just like the papers you were going to write, just like the writing you were going to start working on this week, we do need to write everything in APA style. Now, there's very strict guidelines when it comes to references and citations, and we talked about that last time. But there are also guidelines, just sort of suggestions for ways to write, and you'll see this in the APA style resource. Generally speaking, as I said last time, I expect my students to be writing like undergraduates, not like graduate students or people with PhDs who've been working in the field. So when you read through these articles, you want to pay attention to things like structure and format. How do they organize a paragraph? How do they group information together into subsections, that kind of thing. But ultimately, I want to see your papers be your own words through your own filter. Now we'll talk about the different pieces of a research report. The journal articles that you'll be reading will have all of these pieces in various forms. Title, abstract, introduction. We'll go through and talk about each of these independently. Your paper will definitely have the intro, methods, results, and discussion, and this actually maps on directly to the assignments that we'll do in this class for the final paper. The first 2 assignments are going to be the draft introduction and the revised introduction. The 3rd assignment will be the methods. The 4th assignment will be revised methods and data. And then the 5th assignment will be results and discussion. Now the title page should contain the author's names and their affiliations. You should also have a running head. You don't need a running head in this class, but just be aware of what that looks like. I'll show you on the next slide. Just in case you end up in graduate school or in a different class where the professor would like you to have one of those. The title should be a concise statement of the main topic. As you'll see when you start looking up articles and you've got a list of search results, the first thing that you're going to read is the title, right? And so you want your title to clearly convey what the article is about, because that is the first thing that people are going to use when they're making a decision about whether or not to read further on. This is what a title page should look like. Your running head goes up here in the header. You have your center title here with the author's names. The author note goes down here. You don't need that to be in your papers. After the title page, there will be an abstract. This is a one-paragraph summary of your research. Typically in this class, the abstract is the actual thing that you're going to end up writing the night before it's due. The abstract is the thing that you write last because it's a summary of the entire paper. You can't write a summary of the paper until the paper is done, right? And the abstract covers these four main pieces. Again, think about this as you are looking for your articles. You find a journal article that you might be interested in. It's got a good title. It sounds like they're looking at the same topic that you're interested in. What's the next thing you do? You read the abstract, because the abstract is a summary and it allows you to get a sense of the article without having to spend the time to read the whole thing. Right? And so it covers these four main elements. The next piece of an article is going to be the introduction. The purpose of the introduction is to give the reader all the information that they are going to need to understand why you are doing the research and what your hypothesis means. Ideally, you're going to start your introduction with a general question. You're going to cover all the relevant information that the reader is going to need to know. And by the time they get to the end of the introduction and you say, based on all these things I just told you about, my group is going to predict that people are going to recall more words after they listen to classical music compared to when they listen to hip-hop music or nothing. It's one hypothesis you might have about memory. Right? The idea is that the introduction lays out all the information in such a way that the hypothesis makes sense. The method is the recipe of your study, right? It is how exactly your study was conducted, right? Ideally, the reader should be able to replicate the study. We have a good methods section for this class when we get to this, which will be the third assignment. When we get to this, you know, ideally I'd be able to take your methods section and hand it to another student next semester, and they should be able to replicate your study based on that methods section. You want to think about the methods section the way you think about a recipe for cookies, right? If you've ever made cookies from scratch, there's a specific set of ingredients and a specific order that you need to combine the ingredients together so that you get the tastiest cookies possible. And anyone could hand you a recipe, and with basic knowledge, you should be able to reproduce those cookies. And the methods section is exactly the same. It's a recipe for how to actually do the study. As you are reading through your articles, pay attention to how they structure the methods section. You'll notice that they often contain things like participants, materials if they had some kind of apparatus, or a specific procedure. And all of this is to give you an understanding of how they did the study. Method section will contain participants. This tells you who the participants are, right? This is important because of generalizability. Right? Recall we talked about that idea that we want our sample to generalize to the population, and so you want that information about the participants there. They might also have materials. This will be useful to you as you are preparing your methods section, right? They might use a particular stress measure or depression measure that you'd like to use. And so this is a good place to look for those kinds of measures. They might have a design that you'd like to replicate. You know, you want to do the same study that they did, but maybe make a little change to it. Totally acceptable way to go. And the procedure is going to tell you about that. Now the results section is the climax of the paper. It's the actual results of the study. So for example, in this class, for our first lab, we're going to be asking the research question, do people take longer to pull out of a parking spot when someone is waiting for that spot compared to when no one is waiting for that spot, right? And as I'm sure you're sitting at your computer right now thinking, you're like, yeah, they do, right? And you know, spoiler alert, yes, they do. This is what happens. But when we do that study, we're actually going to go out in the world and we're going to observe cars and we're going to record the amount of time it takes them. And then we're going to compare the amount of time. And the results are the climax. They're what ended up happening. Did they take longer or not? How does that relate back to the hypothesis? This is the structure of a results paragraph. I'm going to sort of gloss over this for now. I'll make reference to this slide later on the semester when you are gearing up to write your results paragraph. At the end of the paper is the discussion. And what the purpose of the discussion is to provide context for the study, right? If you think of the introduction as sort of laying out all the research that has already been done and how that relates to your hypothesis and your ideas, the discussion is how do the results of your study, how does what actually ended up happening in your study, how does that fit in with what we know already? How does that fit in with what you talked about in the introduction? So you want to be making connections between what you did in your study and what you found in your introduction. And that's what happens in the discussion. You may talk about how, maybe you tried to replicate a study and it didn't replicate, or maybe you found something different. You might talk about limitations, right? You get through the study and you realize, oh man, we totally should have done this differently. That's where you would talk about that in the discussion. You also want to talk about maybe ideas for future research. When you are reading through your articles these next couple weeks, this is a good place to look to get research ideas, right? Because you read through an article and they say, okay, based on what we learned, here's some new research questions that we might ask, right? And you might be able to use those. Now, for the references section, we talked about this last time. At the end of the paper, you'll have a references section. You'll include a citation for each source that you used, both in text and in the references section. This is one area where you want to follow that APA style precisely. So I give an example here of a good APA style reference, and then also what it looks like in text. And again, we talked about this in week 1. This is what it looks like if you add a third author. Don't forget, we're always using commas just like we do in real life. So author, comma, author, ampersand for the word and then the last author, okay? Incidentally, when you look at this APA format, all of these commas and spaces and periods, the fact that the title is only capitalized here, but also capitalized after this punctuation, the fact that the name of the journal is italicized, but the page numbers are not, all of that is APA style. Every space, every single character in a reference has a specific purpose or style to it. You won't have appendices in your papers, but appendices are useful in the articles that you're looking up because they will often contain instructions given to participants, or they might contain survey questions that you might be able to use, right? So appendices are useful to you as you are looking through your articles because you might be able to find methodological things, survey items, those kinds of things that you can use yourself. Tables and figures, you won't see these. If you were writing something for a publication, when you write it, the tables and figures are at the end of the paper. But when you read them in an actual article, they're sort of sprinkled throughout as they are necessary. This is an example of what a table might look like in a paper. Again, you're probably not going to have to do this for your paper, but just it's here in case we need to make reference to it. Lastly, I wanted to talk about the difference between a senior thesis, dissertation, a thesis, and an actual manuscript. For a senior thesis, for a thesis or dissertation, the goal of the dissertation is different. The goal of the thesis is different. The goal of a manuscript is just to inform the reader and then describe the results of the study and what they mean. But for a thesis, that's part of the goal. But the other part of the goal is to demonstrate your knowledge of the topic. Right? So often for a thesis, for a dissertation, you have to write a proposal first. And a proposal is an introduction. It's a literature review plus proposed methods. Not this is the study I did, but this is the study I want to do. Right? And then a committee will get together, a thesis committee or a dissertation committee will get together, and they will evaluate your proposal and hopefully give you feedback to make your proposal as good as it can be. And then once they sign off on your proposal, that's when you actually go through the process of of doing the actual research study for your thesis and dissertation. So in this class, we will follow that protocol. Right now, you're working on the beginning of the introduction, but when we get to the methods, your methods section, your draft methods will be a proposal. You'll be saying, this is the study that our group wants to do. And then I will evaluate that proposal, and I'll give you feedback. And I will eventually approve your methods. So you will not actually be able to go out and collect data until you get that approval from me. Right, and the goal here is I just want to make sure that you have a decent study, that we can, that you'll get decent results, or at least decent data, something that we can work with. So we put this in terms of expected results, or in terms of proposed methods. For theses and dissertations, you may need to include IRB material. We'll talk about IRB when we talk about ethics a little bit later on. For your thesis, senior thesis, you will not need to include that at all. All right, so that's it for the lecture for today. Continue on and watch the next video about the draft introduction, what you should be working on this week. As always, if you have questions about these things, feel free to send me an email.